Welcome to Coldstream, historically one of the most important settlements along the length of the Anglo-Scottish border. And over the course of a brief walk around this captivating border town, we'll discover the wealth of history that Coldstream has on display. From a collection of beautiful buildings which line the town's high street, to stunning views over the meandering River Tweed, the waterway which, but for one intriguing exception, forms the border between England and Scotland right beside this town. Meanwhile, we'll also delve into the history of the Coldstream Guards, a famous regiment of the British Army which has been serving continuously for nearly 400 years. And we'll also pay a visit to the captivating Flodden Memorial, dedicated to the hugely consequential 16th century Battle of Flodden, fought just a few miles away, the largest battle ever fought between the kingdoms of England and Scotland. All of that is to come over the next 20 minutes or so, but we begin our walk in the heart of Coldstream, on the High Street, where you'll find grand local landmarks like the Town Hall, which stands proudly just across the road from us here. With the Scottish saltire flying overhead, the Town Hall was built back in 1863, and it remains an important community venue in the heart of town. But it's neighboured by what is without doubt one of Coldstream's most popular buildings of all. This is the Besom Inn, a Coldstream institution which boasts roughly 200 years of its own history. Famous for its gorgeous vine-covered facade, this historic pub was originally built in the early 19th century, at a time when more and more people began travelling through this town, on the road from Edinburgh all the way down to London. That's right, Coldstream's High Street emerged in the late 18th century as a turnpike road linking the Scottish and English capitals. And as we make our way just off the main road, into Henderson Park, it was the growth of passing trade through Coldstream that brought greater prosperity to this town. Indeed, much of Coldstream as we see it today is a product of the 18th and 19th centuries, although Henderson Park here is a little newer, only opened to the public after it was converted from an old tennis court that belonged to one Dr. Henderson, whose family lend their name to the park. A delightful green space, Henderson Park is a must-visit in Coldstream for so many reasons, but most of all it offers some of the very best views over the surrounding landscape, and the highly significant river which just passes to the south of this town. That is the River Tweed, which for part of its length forms the border between England and Scotland. Indeed, from Scotland here we can see English land just on the other side of the river, and a short way downstream there stands the 18th century Coldstream Bridge, the oldest river bridge that spans the Anglo-Scottish border. Now, there are few borders in the world more storied than the one we're looking at here. At this point, the river has been the boundary between England and Scotland for nearly 800 years, formally established all the way back in the year 1237. Though it's fair to say that this remained a hugely contested region for centuries afterwards. There's even a castle turret here overlooking the river. To be truthful, it's not from a real castle. The turret was simply a folly built for Dr. Henderson. But it speaks to the action-packed history of the Scottish borders, a part of Britain which was embroiled in almost constant conflict for centuries, which we'll talk more about a little later on. Meanwhile, just here, there stands a monument dedicated to none other than the Coldstream Guards, who take their name from this town and who are famous as the oldest continuously serving regular regiment in the British Army, able to trace their origins back nearly 400 years to the mid-17th century. Later on in our walk, we'll visit the Coldstream Guards' historic headquarters. But their association with the town of Coldstream here began all the way back in 1660. That was the year when Regiment General George Monk crossed the Tweed here at Coldstream, leading his regiment all the way down to London, in order to restore King Charles II to the throne, after 11 years of Cromwell's Republican Commonwealth. After the restoration, the regiment came to be known as the Coldstream Regiment of Foot Guards, in honour of this seismic moment in British history. But that's far from the only thing which put this fascinating border town on the map. With the Besom Inn standing before us as we've returned to the High Street, we know that Coldstream's main road grew up serving passing trade that travelled on the route from Edinburgh to London. But it wasn't just food, drink and shelter that people were looking for as they passed through this town. The development of the road in the mid-18th century coincided with an uptick in young couples from England fleeing over the border into Scotland, seeking to be wed under more permissive Scottish marriage laws. Now, the most famous place for this practice was the village of Gretna Green, close to the western end of the border. But there were plenty of other locations where runaway lovers would simply head north and seek to be married in the first Scottish place they encountered. And for many on the country's eastern side here, that was Coldstream. Now, the reason for all this was that in 1753, a new law was introduced in England requiring couples to have a formal wedding ceremony inside an Anglican church in order to get married, making it impossible for people to hide potentially controversial marriages with a secret wedding. But that law didn't apply to Scotland, and as such, border towns like Coldstream here became the perfect site for runaway marriages. Although there were also plenty of other weddings held inside the parish church here, which was built just over 300 years ago in 1705. Now, that was a few decades before the development of the Turnpike Road here and the rise of so-called Coldstream weddings. But the distinctive Pepperpot Parish Church points us in the direction of the town's earlier history, back when this part of the country was stricken with a centuries-long succession of border conflicts. The main reason that Coldstream grew up here is because it's located at the lowest point where the River Tweed can be forded. That meaning anywhere further east, downstream towards Berwick and the North Sea some 15 miles away, is too deep to walk across. This made it a strategically important point for armies advancing in either direction along Britain's east coast. And as we know, Coldstream would go on to become closely associated with the military. This army surplus shop on the high street showing us how that military link still holds to this day. But long before General Monk crossed the Tweed in 1660, and the Coldstream Guards gained their name, this was a fairly sparse settlement. In fact, it was simply difficult for medieval Coldstream to grow in size, because it was being caught in the crosshairs of conflict between armies from either side of the border. That included everything from small skirmishes between local raiding parties to full-on invading armies. Most infamously, it was here in the year 1296 that the English King Edward I led his army across the Tweed to launch his invasion of Scotland, which he kicked off by simply destroying the first village that he came across, leaving little but the ruins of Coldstream in his wake as he advanced towards Edinburgh. That was far from the only time though, and we'll pick up the story of Coldstream's endurance through conflict a little later on. But here we find another of the High Street's churches, this one historically known as St Cuthbert's Church, but today popularly known as the Church Centre. Once a Church of Scotland place of worship, since 1963 St Cuthbert's has been used as a community centre. And just down beside its mighty tower, there also stands Coldstream's main War Memorial, which was placed here back in 1923, and which is dedicated to the locals who lost their lives during the First and Second World Wars. Given Coldstream's historic association with the military, the 90 names engraved on the memorial are relatively many for a town of just under 2,000 people, this monument taking on the appearance of a cenotaph, an indication of its significance to the local community. With a prominent position on the town's high street, it's seen by the many people who either walk or drive through the heart of Coldstream every day. But there is of course much more to this town than just this historic main road. So, as we look up towards the top of St Cuthbert's Church Tower, one of just 2 churches remaining in a town which once boasted as many as 5, let's walk a short distance back down the high street, before we turn off and head down towards the historic market square, the old headquarters of the Coldstream Guards, and then the English border. The first point of interest on our way can be noted just to our right, a large high street pub known as the Newcastle Arms. Thought to be a couple of decades younger than the Besom further down the road, the Newcastle Arms was another inn that was set up to provide food and lodging to those travelling through this town on long journeys. And even today, more than 150 years after it first opened, you could still stay overnight inside one of the pub's historic rooms. It also boasts a restaurant, fittingly called the Guards Restaurant after the local regiment. But we'll talk more about them once we've made our way down Market Street here, which, as the name suggests, leads in the direction of Coldstream's historic Market Square. Now, having been obliterated on more than one occasion by invading armies back in the Middle Ages, the village of Coldstream was never an ideal centre for market trade. But its location, at an easy crossing point of the Tweed, was all the more important. In the centuries after England and Scotland joined to form the Kingdom of Great Britain, reduced military conflict and increased travel between nations only added to Coldstream's fortunes. And with the building of the River Bridge and the new road, people from both sides of the border were able to link up and easily do business with one another, buying and selling a wide variety of goods on the town's market square, which is situated just here off the main road. Once upon a time, this would have been the centre of all the action in Coldstream, although over time the majority of businesses and shops began to favour a position on the busier High Street, and eventually this part of town became rather quieter, surrounded mostly by houses. That being said, you will still find a market held in Coldstream even today. The Coldstream Sunday Market is held once a month on a Sunday, and it plays host to all kinds of local traders, offering delightful homemade treats and trinkets, though it's generally held inside the church centre, up on the High Street, rather than on the market square here. But even without the hustle and bustle of a live marketplace, there's still plenty to see in this tranquil part of town. For instance, in between all the houses, on the pavement, you'll find a large tile mosaic depicting the town's coat of arms. In the middle is a large salmon with a cross in its mouth, the nearby River Tweed famed as one of Britain's great salmon rivers, while much of the rest of the shield's iconography can actually be traced back to the medieval Priory of St Mary, a monastery that was founded back in the 12th century, which was infamously targeted time and time again by English forces attacking the borderlands here. Long since gone, the Priory was once one of the most notable features in this border settlement. But as we know today, Coldstream is most famous as the home of the Coldstream Guards. And it's right here that we find the building which for so long served as their headquarters. Founded in 1659, just before General Monk's crossing of the Tweed, these headquarters were later rebuilt in 1963 into their current form, which now hosts the Coldstream Museum, as the regimental headquarters are now located down in London's Wellington Barracks, just across the road from Buckingham Palace. That, if anything, is an indication of the Coldstream Guards' significance within the British Army. As the Army's oldest regiment, technically founded even before the British Army itself, the Guards have been involved in many of the most significant conflicts of the last 4 centuries, all over the world, from the American Revolutionary War to the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, and of course the 2 World Wars. Famously, the Coldstream Guards were among the first to arrive in France in 1914, after Britain declared war on Germany. But another reason that you might have heard of the Coldstream Guards in particular is that they're one of 5 regiments of foot guards who form part of what's known as the Household Division, the soldiers who are tasked with protecting the monarchy. As such, the Coldstream Guards regularly participate in major state occasions, everything from coronations to jubilees and the changing of the guard. You'll also see soldiers of the Coldstream Guards in traditional attire protecting Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle and other major royal residences, and the regiment's band is one of the world's best-known military marching bands. With all of this, the Guards have taken the name of this small Scottish border town and spread it far and wide. But as we now emerge from the town's streets onto the beautiful Riverside Walk, we must turn our attention back to before the time of the Coldstream Guards, when one of the largest battles ever fought on British soil unfolded just a short distance from where we are now. Down beside this flagpole is a humble memorial to the Battle of Flodden, a monumental clash that took place at Flodden Field, located about 3 miles southeast of here on the English side of the border. The battle took place on the 9th of September 1513 during an intense period of Anglo-Scottish conflict, after the Scottish King James IV had led his troops across the border to invade northern England, in retaliation for England's recent invasion of France, an old ally of Scotland. Having stayed in Coldstream in the preceding weeks as his army amassed, James led as many as 40,000 Scots into England, where they were met by some 26,000 Englishmen, led by the Earl of Surrey in service of King Henry VIII. Now, for the time period, these were huge numbers. In fact, to this day, the Battle of Flodden ranks as the largest battle ever fought between England and Scotland in terms of troop numbers, and with such large armies came immense casualties. In short, the battle was a disaster for the Scots. Around 1,500 English troops died at Flodden, while as many as 17,000 Scottish troops were killed in the battle, an exceptional number in just one day. Even worse for Scotland, many of their commanders, members of the country's nobility, were wiped out, and that included King James IV, who that day became the last British monarch to die in battle, leaving behind him a power vacuum in Scotland that precipitated a national crisis. And within all of this major conflict was Coldstream itself, the settlement here escaping on this occasion without total devastation. Although a few decades later, in 1545, Henry VIII's armies attacked a weakened Scotland and destroyed the town of Coldstream once again. As we've seen today though, the people rebuilt, and Coldstream stands a proud town today. And while we were discussing the Battle of Flodden, we've been walking alongside the River Tweed, with the border between England and Scotland running straight down the middle of the waterway. This riverside walk, known as the Nuns' Walk after the old priory which once existed here, offers some of the very best views of the Anglo-Scottish border as it follows the river, although that's not quite the case for every inch of its length. While the border does indeed follow the Tweed as it passes by Coldstream, there is one unusual exception. Just a short distance upstream, on the edge of town, you'll find a tiny exclave, a piece of Scottish land on the southern bank of the River Tweed. It's known as the Bargreen, and it's a small 3-acre field that seems to randomly belong to Scotland on the English side of the river. There's a great story behind it though, because it's said that the Scots won it off the English in a game of football centuries ago. The name Bargreen simply means ball green, and it was the prize for the annual match between the people of Coldstream and the nearby village of Wark on the English side of the border. In a big event each year, men from the two settlements would engage in a chaotic game of football, quite different to the kind you see played today, and the winner would get the Bargreen, that piece of land. Now initially it was quite a competition, but over time Coldstream grew much bigger than Wark, and so with more players, as there was no limit, Coldstream always won, taking the Bargreen on an almost permanent basis, which was eventually formalised when the borders were officially drawn up. And so to this day, Scotland still possesses a piece of formerly English land, which it's said to have won in a football match. But here, the small beach that we can see just across the Tweed is very much a part of England. This magnificent view over the river, standing on the forefront of a border that was fought over so violently for centuries and centuries. Today it's a beautifully peaceful sight to take in, the Northumberland countryside visible in the far distance further south into England. Now, in a couple of minutes' time, we'll head down to the Coldstream Bridge and cross over this international border ourselves to get a glimpse of some English land up close. But for now, we're coming to the end of the Nuns' Walk, where we find a rather prominent local monument. This huge column, easily visible from across the border, soars high above all else in the town of Coldstream, and it has done ever since 1834, when it was erected to honour a man named Charles Albany Marjoribanks. A young politician who served as the MP for Berwickshire, the historic local county, Marjoribanks was seemingly well liked by his colleagues and constituents, described as a man of high talents, amiable qualities, and political principles. Unfortunately, he died in 1833, just over a year after taking his seat in the House of Commons. But he was quickly commemorated by this mighty monument, which today stands as one of the many great landmarks of this fascinating town. But of course, there's more to see just on the edge of Coldstream. So let's now head down towards the bridge and cross over the Tweed into England. So here we are, taking in a view of the majestic Coldstream Bridge, the historic river crossing which carries the road out of Scotland, over the Tweed, and into England. The green and pleasant lands of England are within touching distance on the other side of this calmly flowing river. So we're now going to head up the bank, across the bridge, and into another country. And on the way there are a few more interesting things to talk about. Starting off, the bridge itself is a spectacular landmark. It was originally built in 1766 as part of the new Turnpike Road, carrying traffic from Edinburgh on its way down to London. And the bridge was beautifully designed, with majestic architecture befitting of its position crossing such a significant border. At more than 250 years old, the Coldstream Bridge is in excellent condition today. But our view of the river crossing disappears behind the summer foliage, as we make our way up the wooded northern bank of the Tweed here, a pleasant riverside spot which is known locally as Jacob's Well. Now the path here leads up towards the road, where drivers may be departing Scotland for the last time, or entering the country for the first. A simple welcome sign across the road greeting those having crossed over from England. Now this is an important spot, because on the corner of the bridge here is a small house, originally built for a local engineer, but which later became best known as the Marriage House. After all, at the time the bridge here was built, Scottish law didn't require a formal ceremony for couples to get married. And so those young runaway lovers who fled England for a secret wedding would genuinely get married in the first Scottish place they encountered, which at this part of the border happened to be an engineer's lodgings at one end of the Coldstream Bridge. After tying the knot, many people would simply turn around and walk back across the bridge into England, gazing over the waters of the Tweed for the first time as a married couple. The river is fairly wide at this point, so there's plenty of time to enjoy the surrounding scenery. But as we approach the crest of the bridge, we're about to make our way past the midpoint of the river, which marks the point where Scotland ends and England begins. In fact, just this moment, I think we've crossed the border, and we're now walking along English tarmac, as we leave a nation of 5.5 million people behind, and enter one of some 57 million. Despite all the differences and all the conflict through the centuries, our surroundings have barely changed. And for the people living in the borderlands here, during those years of great strife between rival kingdoms, life on both sides of the river would have felt just like home, regardless of allegiance to one nation or the other, derived from a simple line on a map. But as we make our way off the bridge and walk ever deeper into England, we've left the town that we've been exploring behind. And so it's here that our walk around the captivating border settlement of Coldstream has reached its end. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to making your own trip to Coldstream sometime soon. I'll leave you with one last view of the border post here, marking one of the world's oldest and most significant international boundaries of all.